Hey, you are now listening to the Graceway Podcast. Let's talk with special guest host Jeff Adams.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome again. Jeff Adams here, and I'm getting ready to talk with Pastor Tim Dunn about an amazing message this morning from 1 John chapter 3. So we're going to talk. Pastor Tim, about halfway through your message this morning, I had flashback images in my mind from some of the old war movies that I saw as a kid with Allied planes flying in and dropping just bomb after bomb after bomb.
Okay.
And I was like, wow. and let me hasten to say, this was not you dropping bombs, and you were very specific, like, hey, I'm not here to judge. I'm just telling you what John says.
Yeah, right.
And the sense that I got, this I felt was a profound message. I say that a lot when I listen to you, but this, I think, more than many, because it deals with such a pregnant topic, love. And I think when you really understand what John is saying and the way that you present that, it was crazy. So I'm going to start. I've got more questions than we'll ever have time to answer.
Okay.
But you said something right off the bat, kind of as an introductory throwaway line almost, and it was so powerful. You said this: the church is the apologetic for Jesus.
Yeah.
And I heard that. Of course, I've heard things like that before, but I love the way that you phrased it, the way that you said it. And you gave the example of a couple of extremes in the Christian church, and how there's some pastors and Christians that kind of, to them, the view of maturity is if they can parse Greek words and, dig into systematic theology. My question is this: a correct understanding of love, as John expresses it here in chapter 3, how should that affect our theology?
Yeah.
I'm kind of taking a backward approach at that.
Yeah, and you, I remember when I first came here, which today is the 4-year anniversary.
It is, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Congratulations, happy anniversary.
We made it. We did it.
We did it. Here we are,
we
alive 4 years later, still friends.
That's right. That's right. But remember, we would do those town halls when I came early on, and we did, we tried to pick some of the most flammable topics.
Right.
So we did Calvinism and Arminianism, we did end times, and we did, I don't know, whatever. But I would always say, I'm as concerned with your temperament as I am your theology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that again is one of those that you could take as a throwaway line, but it for me, it isn't.
No, not at all.
I think how should it affect our theology is it's love represents how I hold it, how I communicate it, how I receive your theology. It is the joints and marrow between all of these belief systems and theological frameworks that we have. That there was always supposed to be connectivity in those. What God was teaching you and what God was teaching me, and the relationship between us was supposed to be sharing and enjoying and loving and all this kind of. But we've done frames and these kind of systems now that it's a dividing line, right, for so many of us. And you're on my side or you're not on my side, and it has to be so frustrating to God. It has to be so, just to watch the church. I talked to a guy at one of the prayer deals, this church that he was connected to, and the pastor came in not reformed and now is sort of leaning reformed, but only in the sense of like God knows who's going to,
right,
not like a full-blown tulip, all that kind of deal, and they're trying to fire him, over that.
In the spirit of the love of Jesus.
In the spirit, and that's why I said today, we think love is agreement, and the Bible never talks about it like that. So I think your temperament and your theology are equally important to God.
I see
and indicative of the other, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I see people who tend to look at love through the lens of theology.
Yes.
And so we talk about the Greek words for love and whatnot,
right.
which is kind of ridiculous when you understand that Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic, and there's only one word in Aramaic for love. And which to me is just kind of a strange statement of how we look at love through theology instead of examining our theology in the light of love.
That's
and that's
good.
what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. That's better said than I said it. But yeah,
No, I was just trying to summarize.
No, I think you're kind of turning it on its head, and yeah, that a theology of love versus a loving theology is
That's a good way to say it.
a really
That
important.
top mine, I like that. So get practical for just a second, because you talked a lot about the whole aspect of love resulting in action. Our beliefs determine our actions and things like that. In real life, on a daily basis, I'm a new believer.
Yeah.
Any practical tips for how I assess myself on a daily basis
Yeah.
and in some way evaluate, am I really expressing God's love?
Yeah, I think for me that I tried to wrap it up in me-centered, you-centered, and then this if I can get myself to a spot, and I'll unpack all this. If I can get myself to a spot where I'm you-centered, then what are the stories that I'm telling you? So let's just take our relationship. Am I concerned with how experiences and circumstance affect me primarily? If I'm loving you biblically, I'm at least equally, if not more, concerned with how they're affecting you. And then I'm owning the stories that I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. When I say this, Pastor Jeff would feel. When I do this, Pastor Jeff would hear. And so I think it's a really, really, really practical kind of how much time do I spend thinking about me? How much time do I spend thinking about you? And then what stories are getting taught to both of us around that? Yeah.
In fact, that reminds me of another statement that you made today, where you talked about the very well-known book in Christian circles, The Five Love Languages. And to hear some people talk, it's kind of like the 67th book of the Bible.
Correct, yeah.
And it's also a great tagline in Christian social gatherings, or when you have the first date from a Christian dating site. So what's your love language?
Yeah, that's right.
And
here's my Myers-Briggs. Here's my disc.
all that.
Here's my love language.
So we come at it a little bit backwards. And my question to you is, because I did not take what you said as a criticism of the book.
No,
and I
not
don't
at
feel
all.
that at all.
No,
I think it's a very interesting book, has a lot of good things to say.
Agreed.
But does it seem to you that Christians tend to read it backwards? In other words, like this is the type of love that I want, instead of using it as a tool to say, how can I be more sensitive to the various ways that other people receive love?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think correctly understood, it is, again, a you-centered tool. But we make it a me-centered tool. That's kind of our introductory, and definitely not a criticism of the book. I just was trying to simplify it, because I think, how about this? Let's just, I'll read the book, but you don't have to read the book. Just be intent on serving your spouse. Be intent on serving your kids. Be intent on serving. And for some of us, we don't like that word, but that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you use the word serving. You also use the word sacrifice. And I think sometimes, and I totally agree, but sometimes when we hear the word sacrifice, we think like, well, I'd lay my life down for my wife and kids.
Sure.
Would you get up and bring her a cup of coffee?
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah.
It's the little things, and another bombshell that you dropped today is when you said that love needs a story, or it is merely a sentiment.
Yeah.
That needs to be said. That needs to be screamed. It needs to be written on burned out buildings. It needs to be everywhere.
Why burned out?
Yeah, I mean, it really does. I want you to break that down a little bit. Love needs to be a story, or it's merely a sentiment.
Well, I think it begins with the presupposition that most of us have been taught that love is a sentimental value, right? It's subjective and it's sentimental. So I feel love, I fall into love, I fall out of love. You make me feel loving, you make me feel loved, all those kind of deals. I was really, so I was trying to get at how unhelpful sentimental love is, but that's not really far enough, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, now if that's not, then what is it? And I honestly was just thinking about my relationship with my wife and my kids, and trying to connect a tactile understanding of the story that I tell them about how I feel about them and how I treat them. Yeah. And so, like you said, would you get up and get your wife a cup of coffee? Yeah. So here's an example. For months during COVID, I would get up, and this is not, we could go all day on my failings, but just to give an example, I would get up and make coffee. We're super snobby, both of us, with coffee. So I'd get up and I'd grind the beans, blah, 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 and pour over this, and I'd take it to my wife. And one day I didn't do it, right? And she, not upset, but just like, hey, you didn't make coffee. Oh, sorry, I forgot. But there was a little bit of, more to it. And I said, why? What's up? Why is that such a thing? And she goes, it just was nice to start every day with you doing something to show me you love me.
Wow.
So I didn't realize that I had been telling her a story by doing that. Taking your kids to school without complaining, these little things that we do, showing up at games, these things that we don't think are big deals.
Yeah.
But you're telling those around you a story with your actions about your sentiment, about your feelings. And I think that sometimes we are so confident in how we feel that we forget that I'm not married to a mind reader. Mm-hmm. All she has is the stories that I tell her through my words and my actions. Mm-hmm. And that I'm responsible for the stories that I tell her. She is not responsible to read my mind. I am responsible to paint a picture for her in my deeds and actions that conveys how I feel. So I think we're overconfident in our sentiment. We undermanage our stories, and then we wake up one day and we've fallen out of love, or the kids don't want anything to do with us, and we just haven't been faithful with these simple interactions.
When you were talking about writing a story of love, you used an example this morning that I thought was exceptionally powerful. And you told the story of one of our long-tenured pastors. Yeah. When you came here 4 years ago, you inherited my team.
I did.
And, you're trying to assess, does this person fit under my leadership or not? And you told the story of a man who made an entire series of choices that demonstrated his love for God, for this place, for other people, and how that inspired in you trust and confidence for him. Yeah. And I say that because if you're listening to us talk today and you haven't heard Pastor Tim's message that we're talking about, you must go back and listen to it to get the context of what we're saying. Yeah. And just listen for that story. I'm not asking you to repeat it. But I reference that because, again, on a very practical level, let's say I'm a person who's just stumbled into Graceway a few years ago, and I'm trying to figure my life out. I've made some stupid choices, and I realized that the story that I have been writing in my life has not been a loving story with my spouse, my family, coworkers, whatever. How do I get out of that downward spiral? What would you say to somebody who stops you in the lobby after the service today?
Yeah, I think that's the good news of the gospel, is that regardless of how many chapters have been written in the grace of God, you start on a new sentence, right? And I think that's how when John does that whole bit, we love to pull that if my heart condemns me thing out of context and only talk about condemnation, but John uses that verse in context, knowing that his description and definition of love will evoke guilt and condemnation. Yeah. Nobody's doing this.
Right.
And he has already taught us how to confess our sin. Yeah. And so I think he's pushing us back in that direction. So I think you can't move forward if you don't confess where you've been. Mm-hmm. You can't move forward if you don't let God deal with where you've been. But then the fullest step of repentance is that turnaround move. And you're not in charge of the next chapters, but you can be in charge of the next word or sentence or whatever you want to say. Yeah. So I would just say, when we get revelation from God, we then are stewards of that revelation and apply it to the next right step. Yeah. So even today, I'm thinking about going home. I'm thinking about what story I want to tell my kids today. Yeah. What story I want to tell my wife today. What story I want to talk to somebody in the church today. And God says, hey, don't fret about tomorrow. You don't know I'm going to give it to you. Yeah. Just be faithful today and tell a loving story today. And don't worry about yesterday and don't worry about tomorrow. Just
Good practical advice.
Yeah.
And just like the ultimate illustration, you gave this as well, is what we call the gospel, the good news.
Yeah, right.
How Jesus manifested his love by dying for us.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to go any further than that. That's kind of it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I told that story about Pastor Jay, and I've told that story about Pastor Brandon as well with my son.
Yeah.
One, just because we have great pastors here at Graceway and God's kindness to our church, but faithfulness with today does tell me something about the future.
Yeah.
Whenever John says reassuring our hearts before him, looking at the stories that have been given to us, I basically said, I trusted Jay with my 4 years here because I heard some stories about his tenure with you.
Sure.
And I think that that's really powerful for us to be able to understand that if we'll be faithful with our stories today, there's trust can get built quicker than we think.
Yeah.
And
while we do learn from past perspective, as you just said, I love the practical aspect of what we've been talking about. This person, like, hey, I've written a pretty crummy story to this point. And at that time, the focus should not be on guilt about the past, but rather focusing forward, that I can start a new story today.
Yeah, agreed. Yes.
You have done something all the way through this series that maybe the average viewer would not notice, but as somebody who has been involved in your craft for a long time, has not escaped my attention of how you have deftly quoted from John's writings, all of them, taking us through 1 John. When it's been necessary to go to another biblical reference, it's almost always been John. And what I've taken away from that, confirm this or not, is that your goal has been not to explain words on a paper in terms of theology, but to show us who John was and why he said what he said.
Yeah, and it's even more personal than that. I've really fallen in love with this guy. I'm looking forward to meeting him in eternity. But yeah, I've spent a lot of time, not so much in Revelation, but
but you have been there.
I have been there, yeah, and have jumped deeper into Revelation 2 and 3 than I had for a little bit. Yeah. But yeah, I am very interested in the introduction of the dual authorship, the Holy Spirit and then John. And, that's that's funny that you picked that up.
Of course I picked that up. And I love that because that one of my big sticks is you have to understand the Bible in context. And that's exactly what you're doing, but in the human context.
In the human context,
there's a geographical context, a linguistic context, a historical context, all of that. But there is also very definitely a human context.
And I, you and I have talked about this, but there has to be an earthiness to context. And I think that sometimes when we hear, and we'll get nerdy here for a second, when preachers hear context, we assume it's theological context.
Yeah.
No. In everyday life, somebody wrote this book. What is the granular, agrarian, flesh and blood context of this? And I think it keeps us off of some of the silly theologies that we come up with trying to ascertain, in Job it said, no, John was not referencing Job.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it humanizes in a really helpful way our understanding of the Bible and keeps us from some of these odd things when we're trying to get to know someone.
We tend to get into those odd things.
We do tend to.
I have fought that all of my life. You have to resist it all the time.
Yeah.
You dropped another. In fact, this would be the hydrogen bomb that you dropped today, talking about bombshells. But you really went to the very heart of what John is saying here in this passage in 1 John, and here's what you said, and I think is a pretty accurate quote. You said, John is not saying that Christians who don't love well are bad Christians.
Yeah.
He's saying they may not be Christians.
Correct.
I'm like, wow. I can still see the mushroom cloud after that one.
I know. For as many years as you were week in and week out in the pulpit, how sometimes people think that there's enjoyment in saying those kind of, that there is not.
There is none.
There is none. I I reworked that passage 4 times to not have to say that.
Yeah.
And it is unavoidable.
It is
as you read
unavoidable.
through that text.
Yeah.
And it is not, there are some people who land on, John didn't believe in eternal security and all this kind. He's saying none of that.
No, that's not
He's saying,
the issue.
No, this testimony of love is so central to the gospel and so central to the church that if it is regularly missing, you should not have assurance.
Okay, with that, let me go in a couple of different directions.
Yeah.
First of all, and again, we've talked about this much, spent a significant part of my life in other countries.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's been beastly hard at times to connect with the American church.
Sure.
We're really struggling with that right now because of the hate that we see that is being espoused from Christian circles.
Yeah.
And you said it earlier that we tend to define love in some circles as being in total agreement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Church, capital C, what can we do to fix that? Or is it fixable? Or how do we respond to John's message in terms of global church in America?
Yeah. And you and I are both pretty macro in the way that and in God's sense of humor and kindness, we have a lot of people watching from a lot of different places. But really the only way to fix the church at the global level is right here.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is no macro plan. The only plan is this one-to-one re-engagement with the gospel, re-engagement with conversation, re-engagement with humility and some of the practices that, and I think, I don't want to be grandiose about this. I don't think it's like the church needs to be stripped down to the studs. No. The church, the idea of the church is just fine.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It works when we do it.
Yeah.
We have just let some things creep in that we need to kick out, and we have to start at the relational level.
And I thought you did an excellent job this morning when you addressed the whole mask wearing issue.
Sure.
For those in other places here in Kansas City, we've gone back under a mask order, where we were out from that for a few months.
Yeah.
And you complimented everyone on their attitude in putting the mask on, not as a political statement or otherwise, but simply as an act of love for our society, for our neighbor. Yeah. And that is, I think, addressing the big church issue when we do it at our level.
Correct. Yeah.
Us as individuals and then that. And I was very encouraged by what you had to say. It made me think of something else. You made the statement that, as you were beginning, that John here has these 2 buckets. One is love and the other is hate. And you're in one bucket or the other. And I reflected on that throughout the whole time that I was listening to you this morning, and I realized I do a retirement side gig of strategic planning, and I use 1 to 10 scales a lot.
Sure. And
we use it in daily life. You take your car in, they send you a survey on a scale of 1 to 10. How pleased are you? How much would you recommend us to another person? And I thought of how in the church, when we talk, because we've made love a feeling, we tend to rate it on a 1 to 10 scale. I love you, kind of a level 4 today.
Solid 4.
A solid 4.
Yeah.
And it was -3 yesterday, but today it's a solid 4.
That's right.
And it seems to me like that's not applicable to love.
No.
And you define that, at least I think this is what I heard you say, that love is basically deciding to make a commitment. And it's a long-term commitment. It's an eternal commitment.
It is.
I'm either going to love you or
Christian
I'm not.
love is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that 1 in 10 scales have no place here.
No, I really meditated a lot on that because John, in some ways, John is so nuanced. And so...
In some ways he's not.
And in some ways he's violently not.
Yeah.
And this is one of those violently nots. I'm dying for him to put another row of buckets that people can live in outside of love and hate. But I think, as I kind of meditated on it, I think that our love bucket and our hate bucket are both too small. That there are things that we do that the Bible calls hateful that we don't think are hateful. And because we don't really want to, it's easier for us to think of love in the ways that we've been taught, sentimentality and all those kind of things. it's even harder for us to evaluate hate because we don't even like to think about ourselves being hateful or us hating somebody or any of those kind of things.
Can I ask you to repeat your definition of hate that you gave this morning? That was profound as well.
Yeah, I think that what John is getting at is whenever I use somebody for a purpose other than God intended, I dehumanize them.
Yeah.
And, whenever I say, I don't like Jeff because he makes me feel X, well, I've just commoditized you into that 1 to 10, right?
Yeah.
Jeff makes me feel like a 2, and I feel like I'm a solid 6.
Yeah.
So I don't like Jeff at least 4 points, right? You
Yeah.
know? And I have turned you into a thing
Yeah.
that either benefits or doesn't benefit for me, instead of grappling with the wholeness of who God has made you to be, good and bad.
Yeah.
And grace from God on all of those kind of things. So yeah, that definition of hate, when I dehumanize and use you for something other than God says I'm free to, that's a big bucket at that point.
That's a huge bucket.
Yeah.
And as you say that, the image that comes to my mind is when our kids were very little.
Okay.
They only had 2 buckets.
Right.
Daddy, I love you.
Yeah.
Daddy, I hate you. There
Right.
was no middle ground.
No.
And, it hurts us, pains us as parents when they say that they hate us.
Yeah.
But what is happening is they're dehumanizing us because God has put us in their life for a purpose.
That's right.
And when they don't like that purpose, then they hate us.
That's right.
And it's so easy for kids to see that.
Yeah.
But then we get mature, we get old, we get wise,
Get
and
nuanced.
we begin
Yeah.
to nuanced.
But you think about some of the behavior that we have seen, or maybe that we've done, if we're honest, that we would say, no, I just disagree, or no, I just think you're this, or no, I treated you hatefully.
Yeah.
John is very wise to not let there be much nuance here, because it forces you
Yeah.
to say what I did, what I believed, what I said was hateful.
Right.
Not, these kind of squishy, no, it's hateful. I dehumanized you. I invalidated you. I told you, I said things to you because I didn't like how you made me feel, but you're not on this earth for me. You're on this earth for the glory of God. And I just wonder, if we only had those 2 buckets, how the last 18 months would have gone.
Kind of reminds me of what Paul said, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Yeah.
And I think that's what John is doing here. He has used that nuance to lead us to a very forceful decision.
Yeah.
Which side are we on here?
Yeah.
Well, Pastor Tim, we could go on and on about this for hours, and should, because this is such a powerful message. And again, I just want to say to those of you watching, listening to us, if you did not hear this message, you need to hear it. And if you did hear it, go back and listen to it and forward it to somebody else, because this is a powerful statement. And I think that 1 John is a book that is very commonly misunderstood. And I love and respect the way that Pastor Tim has taken us to a fresh look, which is really the old look of 1 John. So thank you, Pastor Tim, and we'll do this again next week.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for tuning into the Graceway Experience. Hope we can talk again sometime.